and share my screen here and turn off my camera. Okay. Hold on, I'm having trouble getting my... There we go. Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, great, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So thank you everyone for joining. I know you've had a lot of these webinars, so I'm really happy that you were able to join and talk about harvest strategies specifically today. And so today we're going to talk about fishing for the future, harvest strategies, and the Tuna Traceability Declaration. So first of all, what is a harvest strategy? It's a pre-agreed framework for making management decisions, and it's akin to agreeing the rules before you play the game. And there are three basic parts of a harvest strategy. One is the monitoring data and how we collect those data, an analysis method to take those data and get some idea of stock status. So that's the second piece. And then the third is the harvest control rule, which is the operational part of a harvest strategy that tells us, based on stock status, how many fish are we going to be able to catch. So those are the three fundamental pieces of a harvest strategy. And ideally, those harvest strategies, the candidates will be evaluated and selected using a scientific process called Management Strategy Evaluation, or MSE. And because we like to make things complicated, we have all sorts of jargon, including management procedure, which is equivalent to a harvest strategy. But in some regions, in some fisheries, you will hear the term management procedure. And so for today's purposes, just assume when I say harvest strategy, the two are equivalent and interchangeable, same term. So why are harvest strategies a preferred method of fisheries management? And this is quite a long list here. They offset natural variability and scientific uncertainty, as well as political influence because of the pre-agreed nature of the harvest strategy. They allow for balancing trade-offs and accounting for risk. They increase the transparency, predictability, and stability of management, which gives you stability both in industry as well as the market, which is of course important to many of your groups. They also facilitate swift and efficient management response to benefit both the resource as well as the industry. And harvest strategies are a means to effectively implement the precautionary approach, which of course is a requirement of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, as well as the Marine Stewardship Council requires that as well, and even specifically requires harvest strategies. So how is harvest strategies related to the Tuna 2020 Traceability Declaration? There's actually two of the elements, as you probably all know, that specifically, two of the four elements that specifically mention harvest strategies. Both the environmental sustainability element as well as the government partnership element mention harvest strategies. And the government partnership piece has an especially ambitious target for harvest strategies in that it calls for implementation of harvest strategies for all tuna stocks under each of the tuna RFMOs by this year. And, you know, these were set back in 2017, and even back then, calling for harvest strategies for all tuna stocks within a few years was ambitious. But of course, now that we're in 2020, we can be pretty assured that this isn't going to happen. But the key is to continue to make advances in this area and to get these harvest strategies in place within the next couple of years. So two of the challenges for achieving these two elements of the TTD that were identified in your progress report was the capacity of GTA partners to do the government outreach themselves, and also the need for education. And so today is, you know, hopefully going to help on the education side, and this presentation will hopefully complement the one that you received, I think, a couple of months ago on RFMO engagement, where you talked about the need to put harvest strategies in place, but didn't go into as much detail on them. So that's what we're going to do today. So there are 5 basic steps of harvest strategy development. You know, the first is setting your management objectives. The second is developing your management strategy evaluation tool, the MSE. The third is running the MSE. The fourth is adoption of your harvest strategy. And because of the iterative nature of harvest strategy, your step 5 is implementation of the harvest strategy. Because even though this is harvest strategies allow you to pre-agree the rules before you play the game, there is a constant feedback loop and reevaluation of the harvest strategy and its effectiveness once it's on the water. And just to point out 2 important pieces here. One, this is a general flow chart of how the process works, but there is flexibility in the way the steps are ordered. And then secondly, this process is a step forward, and a step forward in the inclusiveness of management, in that scientists, managers, and stakeholders are involved. And so in this box in step 2, just to note that it's the scientists are these open circles and the managers are the closed circles. And so the stakeholders, you know, come in with the managers. So just to show that at each step of the process, you're going back and forth between scientists and managers, which is, you know, very different from the way traditional management has the scientists give you a stock assessment and their advice, and then the managers deciding how to act upon it. So this is a much more partnered approach to fisheries management. So starting with step 1, setting the management objectives, the idea is to set the vision for the fishery. Where are we trying to go with this fishery? And your management objectives, you'd want them to be consistent with your RFMO's convention objectives, many of which are to achieve BMSY, for example, achieve that biomass associated with maximum sustainable yield. But for management objectives in a harvest strategy context, we're going to take it to the next step by making specific and measurable objectives, by including probabilities and timelines. You know, for example, we want to achieve BMSY with 75% probability by 2025. So to have much more specific and measurable objectives. And importantly, you can also weight the objectives by priority. And so here are some examples of there's 4 main categories of management objectives. And so these would be the 4 categories that you could decide on a weighting of. So the first is status. You know, you want your stock to be at a healthy level. safety, you want your stock to avoid a dangerously low level. Yield, of course, we want to maximize catches as best as possible while balancing these other objectives. And abundance, to maximize catch rates, which of course increases the profitability of fishing if you can not just maximize your catch, but you're also maximizing your catch rates. And then in your fifth category here is stability, to minimize the change in your catches from year to year, which is good from an industry stability perspective as well as a market stability perspective, because we've certainly seen, if there are drastic increases in catch and product available in the markets, of course that has impacts on pricing. And so these 5 categories, I had mentioned 4 categories before. Sometimes yield and abundance are combined into one category. But these are your 5 areas that you could prioritize, and typically your safety objective is put as your highest priority to avoid that dangerously low level of abundance for a population. Okay, so moving to step 2 in your MSE development phase, I'm guessing most of you have heard about reference points in the context of fisheries, and these reference points are the benchmarks we use to compare the current stock status to a desirable or undesirable state. So your BMSY is the most common reference point for fisheries, and is typically a target reference point. And so what we have at what we call a target reference point is the level of abundance of a population where we want to be. We want to be most of the time above this target, and the target is set with a combination of biological factors, what is a healthy population from a biological perspective, as well as socioeconomic factors. For example, if you deplete a population to BMSY even, sometimes, for skipjack, for example, that might put too much product on the market and decrease prices so much that it wouldn't be worth catching them. And so your target for skipjack might be much higher than BMSY because of those socioeconomic concerns related to pricing, jobs, etc. And then your limit is the level at which, if you go below, you're going to put the stock in considerable danger. And so toggling back and forth between these two, you want to have a buffer, a big enough buffer between your target and your limit, that if you drop below your target reference point for the size of your population, that you have enough time and warning to take management action to avoid dropping below that limit. So looking at the harvest control rule, which I had mentioned is the operational part of a harvest strategy, that is the actual rule that says based on your stock status, this is what your management action is going to be. And often that indicator of stock status is a reference point, your current population size relative to your target and limit reference points. So this is an example here. Many of you have probably seen the Kobe plots, which show population size on the horizontal axis and fishing mortality on the vertical axis. And so we use these colors to show, green is good, where you want to be, whereas red is your avoid zone and yellow is your buffer zone. And so looking at your target reference point here, so we want to be above our target. we definitely don't want to be below our limit. And for fishing mortality, your limit is higher, because with higher fishing mortality, that's where we get into danger, and your fishing mortality target is going to be a bit lower. So when we put the harvest control rule on this, you can see this is kind of a generic form of a harvest control rule, whereas if you're above your abundance target, you're fishing at your target fishing mortality rate, and we call that just a maintenance phase. However, if our biomass drops below our target, we're going to lower our fishing mortality to allow rebuilding of the stock. And so this is a straight linear relationship of a linear decline in fishing mortality from your target all the way to stock extinction here. This is, you know, would not be used in practice because of course you don't want to let your stock go to extinction. So it might look more like this, where you have a steeper decline in your reduction of fishing mortality and close the fishery entirely when you hit this danger level of your limit. You can do all different shapes and sizes of harvest control rules. These are just examples, and these are the type of forms of the harvest control rule that most of the tuna regional fisheries management organizations are considering. So then moving on to MSE, the actual testing process that's used to evaluate which harvest control rule and which harvest strategy would best meet your management objectives that you set up here in step 1. MSE is a simulation tool that is taking into account your uncertainties, looking at your different candidate harvest control rules and harvest strategies, and evaluating which of those will best meet your oftentimes competing management objectives. And competing, by that I mean, you know, you can't ever maximize the size of your population while also maximizing catch. So those are the kind of trade-offs that MSE can help you balance. And some people, some scientists refer to MSE as the entire process for developing harvest strategies. So, you know, this entire piece here is your MSE. And so that gives you an idea of how fundamental MSE is to the process. And the scientific modeling side of it is very complex, and so we won't get into that here, but just like Tom had shared an animation that we had produced on harvest strategies in general, we've also produced an animation on MSE, which I will ask Tom to share with you all after this webinar in case anyone wants to dive a little deeper into this. So moving on to step 4, the adoption of the harvest strategy. This is where scientists and managers, the scientific input is put into the hands of the managers again, with advice from stakeholders like yourselves to have the managers take those MSE results and determine which harvest strategy they think will be most robust to the uncertainties in the system and to be most effective at achieving the management objectives for that stock. So this is kind of where the rubber hits the road at the management meeting and the harvest strategy is adopted. And so importantly, even though MSE is you know, fundamentally a scientific process, it does include the participation of managers and stakeholders throughout, like I'd mentioned, and importantly, the managers have control over both the first step of selecting management objectives. It's the managers that will set those management objectives, and it's also the managers who will adopt the actual harvest strategy. And, you know, importantly, throughout the process, stakeholders can be involved. You know, they can advise the managers on what the objectives should be. They can participate throughout the scientific process, and they can also, of course, advise the managers on adoption. So, you know, I can't stress this enough, and it's what gives Global Tuna Alliance partners such an opportunity to play a role in this, because compared to traditional fisheries management, the harvest strategy process is dependent upon stakeholder involvement, and that's in part what makes it so much stronger, because the fishery members have a vested interest in it, because their desires and opinions and goals have been factored in from the beginning and at every step of the process. So again, just looking at the first and last step, it's, you know, where do we want to go and how are we going to get there? And so just to, you know, keep those in mind for points where we as stakeholders can help weigh in and help to direct managers. So like I said, step 5 in the implementation is actually a really important part of the harvest strategy. And so you go through this feedback loop where you're going to, you know, you've adopted your harvest strategy. You're going to set, for example, your catch limit based on your harvest control rule. Then you're going to collect data on that fishery and see how things are going. Take stock of your current status of your fishery, your fishing mortality rates, your population size. Then you're going to compare the status of the current fishery to your reference points that you've agreed as part of your management objectives. And then you're going to ask yourself, are we meeting our objectives? And, you know, say this cycle is 3 years long. Say you set a catch limit for 3 years. Typically, a harvest strategy will have a 3 to 5 year cycle. So you're not doing this every single year. But at the end of that 3 or 5 years, you're going to ask yourself the question of whether you're meeting your objectives. If the answer is yes, you're going to go back into your loop and keep implementing. But if the answer is no, you're not locked into this harvest strategy, and you can reevaluate and revise your harvest strategy as appropriate to make sure that you continue to meet those objectives. So that's kind of the general overview of what a harvest strategy is and how it works. And just to get into harvest strategies at the tuna RFMOs, particularly, since that's what, of course, the Tuna Traceability Declaration is interested in. And currently we only have 3 harvest strategies in place at the tuna RFMOs. So the first was Southern Bluefin tuna, which is a fully specified harvest strategy, and that was adopted in 2011. In 2016, IOTC in the Indian Ocean adopted a harvest control rule for skipjack. And the reason I say harvest control rule instead of harvest strategy like we have for Southern Bluefin is that the harvest control rule is specified, but the other 2 components of monitoring data and the assessment method are not formally agreed as part of the measure. And so that's something that IOTC will be looking to do in the coming years. At ICAT in the Atlantic Ocean, we have a harvest control rule in place for North Atlantic albacore. So those are the 3 stocks that currently have harvest strategies in place. If you look at harvest strategies in development, you see a much different picture. And we have many species, many stocks all over the world. And so this shows you that this is really the direction that fisheries management is moving. And all of these species have MSC processes that are ongoing, that, you know, we as stakeholders can engage in. And they're at different stages of progress, but, you know, just to show that albacore, bluefin, yellowfin, big eye, skipjack, swordfish, mahi-mahi, you know, those 7 species globally have harvest strategies being developed. A little bit of a report card for the tuna RFMOs on how they're doing with their harvest strategy development. The gold standard is the Convention for the Conservation of Southern Bluefin Tuna, which, as I mentioned, adopted a full harvest strategy for Southern Bluefin Tuna back in 2011. And so you see green checks in all of these steps: your management objectives, your reference points, your harvest control rules, and your harvest strategy. And, you know, it's important to note that the success of this harvest strategy for Southern Bluefin, which has been in place for almost a decade now, as far as its ability to increase both the population size and allowable catches, is why the other tuna RFMOs in large part have decided to move in this direction, because the approach really does work for the fish and the fishermen. You know, Southern Bluefin tuna was very, very depleted when this harvest strategy was adopted, but the way that it works, it allows increases to the catch rates even before the stock is considered to be fully rebuilt. And, you know, at this point, the Southern Bluefin tuna may not be recovered fully for another 10 or 15 years, but you're still seeing a case where the catch limits can go up because of how the harvest strategy works. So looking at the other tuna RFMOs, the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, IATTC, which operates in the Eastern Pacific, you'll see that they have not specified formal management objectives, but they do have both reference points and technically a harvest control rule in place since 2016 for big eye, yellowfin, and skipjack. They're tropical tunas. Now, you'll note that I didn't mention this harvest control rule on the slide 2 earlier, and the reason for that is that the harvest control rule was not tested using MSE. And the way the harvest control rule works is it says that if you're overfishing, you stop overfishing. And if your population size is below BMSY, you try to recover it to BMSY. And so they're calling this a harvest control rule, but it's the way tuna fisheries have been managed for decades now. So we don't consider it a full, you know, harvest control rule, and neither does IATTC, as evidenced by the fact that they are undergoing an MSC process for these species to eventually adopt a legitimate harvest control rule. But technically, they have a harvest control rule in place. Moving over to the Atlantic, the ICAT has adopted management objectives for the stocks noted here, same with reference points, and then, as I'd mentioned, they have the harvest control rule for North Atlantic albacore. The same you'll see here for IOTC with the different stocks noted. WCPFC is unique in that their management objectives, they have adopted them not just for stocks, namely Pacific bluefin, North Pacific albacore, and North Pacific swordfish, but they've also adopted management objectives for fisheries, their tropical tuna purseine fishery, as well as their longline fisheries, both their southern longline fishery and their more tropical longline fishery. So WCPFC has employed a slightly different approach, and that is completely fine. You can do a harvest strategy on a stock, or you can have a fishery specific harvest strategy, which, you know, can be useful for multi-species fisheries like the purse seine fishery that will catch, you know, big eye, yellowfin, and skipjack all at the same time. They do not have any harvest control rules in place yet, nor do they have any harvest strategies in place. So we'll go one by one through all of the tuna RFMOs, but CCSBT. We'll just go through these quickly, just to show you where things stand for each of the stocks that they are developing. Looking again towards that 2020 TTD goal of harvest strategy adoption for each of the major stocks. So ICAT has been doing this in earnest since 2015, agreeing to adopt harvest control rules for 8 priority stocks by 2021. You see here, this is the work plan, the roadmap they call it, that was adopted in the fall. And that roadmap has adjusted the timeline for adoption and delayed things a little bit. So ICAT is now planning on adopting its full management procedure, they call them, but we'll call them a harvest strategy for today. A full harvest strategy for North Atlantic albacore this year. Next year for bluefin tuna for both the western and eastern populations. 2022 for North Atlantic swordfish, and then in the 2023 to 2024 realm for tropical tunas. Moving to the Indian Ocean, they started their effort a little bit earlier in 2013, adopting a framework for setting target and limit reference points, as well as a decision framework, which would be, you know, your harvest strategy as a framework for making decisions. And then in 2016, they established a working group dedicated entirely to developing harvest strategies. Their current work plan is from 2017, and you'll see that they were calling for harvest strategy adoption for 4 stocks this year. We're not going to meet that timeline, and so they will adopt an updated work plan this year. And the current proposal which has not been adopted yet, but the current proposal is to adopt a harvest strategy for yellowfin next year, big eye the following year, albacore, and expanding that skipjack harvest control rule to a full harvest strategy by 2023, and then swordfish sometime after that. Looking at WCPFC, they adopted an overall mandate to move toward a harvest strategy approach back in 2014, and in 2018 set goals to adopt a skipjack harvest strategy this year, South Pacific albacore next year, and then big eye and yellowfin next year as well. Yellowfin I have grayed out here because it's possible that they will delay yellowfin under the argument that if they're managing skipjack and big eye, at least in the short term, that will provide some management for yellowfin. But just to note that in light of coronavirus and meeting delays, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if these dates get pushed back by a year, but this is the current work plan. And WCPFC has taken really good strides to do capacity building and outreach on their harvest strategy effort. So just to note that their website noted here has a lot of information compiled on one page for where they are in the harvest strategy development process, including for their northern stocks, North Pacific albacore and Pacific bluefin tuna, the science of which is being handled by the ISC, the International Scientific Committee, since these 2 stocks overlap both WCPFC and IATTC. And the way the current management frameworks are, even though they have these MSC processes in place scheduled to end next year for North Pacific albacore and 2024 for Pacific bluefin. They're using the term harvest strategies for these two stocks about the management already in place. So again, a little bit confusing from a terminology perspective, because this is not, even though they're calling it harvest strategies, it's not the harvest strategy that we're talking about today. IATTC, like I said, they have this, quote unquote HCR in place. Last year, they completed an MSE for mahi-mahi. They did not formally adopt a harvest strategy last year because there was some question, even though they were ready to do so, there was some question as to whether IATTC had jurisdiction over mahi management. So I think the jury is still out on that. But there is a new MSE underway for big eye tuna, rather, looking to complete that MSE and adopt a full harvest strategy in 2023, and they will then move on to yellowfin and skipjack. So looking at the MSC, there is a requirement that harvest strategies complete with harvest control rules be in place to be a certified fishery. And so these are the stocks that currently have MSC certification with conditions on their certification related to harvest strategy adoption. So in the Western and Central Pacific, we have yellowfin, skipjack, and South Pacific albacore with fisheries that require harvest strategy adoption by 2021 to maintain their certification. In the Atlantic, we have Western skipjack and yellowfin that must have harvest strategy adoption by 2022. And then North Pacific albacore, some certified fisheries that need a harvest strategy in place by 2023 to maintain their certification. Looking at the tuna traceability declaration specifically, as we showed these before, these two arms that require harvest strategies. And so looking at your TTD report card, just looking at how impactful the harvest strategy elements are, under environmental sustainability, this example did not have any progress on harvest strategies, but if we add progress on harvest strategies, that will give us a yellow or orange, I'm not sure which color that's supposed to be, and it will boost our environmental sustainability score from 0% to 25%. So it'll give us a 25% boost right off the bat just from harvest strategies. For government partnership, we have here development of harvest strategies and control rules. If we move from a red to a green, that similarly gives us a 25% boost in our government partnership score. So with just harvest strategies action alone, we move from 0 to 25% under 2 of the 4 elements. And that will boost our overall performance, in this case, from 15% all the way up to 27.5%. And across the board, no matter where you stand in this report card, progress dashboard, I guess it's called, harvest strategy action alone will boost your score by 12.5% overall. And so it's really an impactful element of the TTD. And that's all I'm going to share for today, to leave room for questions, but just to acknowledge I work for the Ocean Foundation, but I work very closely partnering with the Pew Charitable Trust, and these names listed here are members of our harvest strategy team as part of Pew and the Ocean Foundation's partnership. And also just some links here to our presence on social media, as well as websites where you can get our harvest strategies materials, including those 2 animations, if you'd like to dive deeper. So with that, Tom, I guess I'll turn it back to you, and we can go through some Q&A if that works for you.
Great, thank you very much, Shana. That was excellent presentation, and I was quite surprised to see the percentage increase on the dashboards. Something I hadn't worked out before. So when we went through the slides, that was a real eye opener, and it just goes to show the importance of it and how it can actually make an impact. So yes, we would love to open it up. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to just sort of shout them out, or if you prefer, use the chat function, whatever's easiest for you.
Put my video back on.
Well, I've got a quick question myself. Do you have any advice for members of the supply chain who are looking to advocate for harvest strategies? Anything the supply chain should be doing to get RFMOs to implement them?
Yes. So I know through the Global Tuna Alliance that you have already provided some guidance on RFMO outreach and government outreach, and this year your goals that you've set, I believe for ICAT, is the only RFMO in which you're engaging that your goals are not related to harvest strategies. So for IOTC, IATTC, and WCPFC, there are harvest strategy elements for each of those. And so, supporting people like Tom, who can advocate full time on these issues, but also reaching out to your own government officials and telling them specifically for your group, for your company, what is important to you. From what species do you want to be able to take to market? What is your pricing goal? What kind of tonnage target do you want to be able to provide to the market? Those are some questions that managers are grappling with right now. And so any sort of direct outreach to governments is valuable and helps them set their positions going into these RFMO meetings. Ideally, we would love for market representatives and retailers to sometimes, even if it's just one time to see how it works, to go on a government delegation to one of these meetings to get a better idea of the dynamics and how the decisions are made and how the dialogue among scientists and managers takes place. And so I would strongly suggest that. Oftentimes government delegations, the stakeholders are mostly fishermen, and I think the market side has oftentimes slightly different takes on what should be done and how. And so any sort of outreach that your companies can do directly to governments would be valuable, even if it's just a letter. We hear from governments and they will mention letters on the floor if they get co-signed letters from a number of different retailers. For example, they will bring up the positions from those letters on the floor. So your voices are heard, and just to continue being vocal and try to move into some face-to-face interaction with the managers, I think is really the next step.
Thank you very much. I've got another question here on the chat thing. What are the biggest obstacles in achieving harvest strategies?
Very good question. This is something that we talk about every day, of course. One piece is that the MSE is so technically complex that there are really only, say 20 analysts globally that know how to do them well and confidently. And so there's a lot of demand for those people's time across all of these tuna stocks, for example. You know, there's one analyst that's working on at least 5 of the MSCs that I know of. So there's a capacity issue on the science side for the managers and stakeholders. Because this is a new approach, there's also a lot of questions and need for capacity building. So we're trying to get those pieces up and running, and, you know, including by having webinars like this, because it's different. It's a different approach. And, you know, we've been managing fisheries more or less the same way, with a stock assessment followed by, you know, haggling over annual quotas, for example. We've been doing that for 5 decades. And so this is a different approach, and it takes a while to get people comfortable with it. So I would say those are the 2 biggest obstacles. But you know, from an opportunity side, the tuna RFMOs have all agreed to do this. And so it's just a matter of when, not if. And so, you know, it's about getting people on board, getting people understanding the process, and going through each step to ensure that we have sound harvest strategies in place that will be, you know, effective once they're implemented.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important point, that we don't, you know, we don't have to convince them of the importance or the need to do this. They are mandated to do it. It's about pushing the timeline so the pace is, well, so that we see these in our lifetimes. Any other questions?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. This is Christine from Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you, Shana, very much for the presentation. I'm always, I know I have the opportunity to speak to you probably daily, but I always learn every time you are presenting on harvest strategy. So thank you for that presentation. And my question was just going to go to that when and to that timeline as to if you could, you know, if there were a crystal ball, or if there's some way you could predict, you know, what would happen with harvest strategies and the harvest control rules if they are not adopted according to the timeline that you laid out by the tuna RFMOs, and maybe like specifically, what are the consequences for perhaps the demand side or the end market for buyers and retailers? Are there any predictions that you could make or discuss some of the implications if those harvest strategies aren't adopted according to the timeline?
Sure. Thanks, Christine. And Christine, I should say, was also integral in getting this webinar set up today. So thank you, Christine, for that. Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, certainly for I think there's 5 stocks that will lose their MSC certification. And for those 5 stocks, there's a number of fisheries for some of them. So, you know, roughly 10 MSC certified fisheries will lose their certification. So that's probably the most tangible, you know, negative consequence of delays. But, you know, like I mentioned before, there are a number of benefits of having harvest strategies in place. So the longer implementation is delayed, the longer achievement of those benefits is delayed. And so, for example, you know, any fisheries assessment will have uncertainty in it. We hear that all the time. You know, like a famous fisheries assessment scientist told me that the only thing they know about assessments is that they're wrong. You know, that's the only thing they can say with confidence, is that the abundance estimate they come up with is not correct. And so, you know, by going through the harvest strategy process, you can account for that uncertainty and balance it, and still end up with a harvest strategy that's going to result in, you're going to know how that harvest strategy is going to work, versus, for example, big eye tuna in the Atlantic. We all of a sudden, several years ago found out that the stock was in a lot of trouble, and we didn't know that. And so it resulted in more severe cuts to catch than would have been required if a harvest strategy were in place, for example, because we would have detected that decline earlier. And so it's that instability in both the population size and the catch levels because of that, if you don't have a harvest strategy in place, you can result in some pretty severe declines in allowable catches, and thus the tonnage of fish available on the market side. And it's really, the problem with traditional management is that we don't have a good idea of where the fishery is going to be in 5 years from now. Whereas with a harvest strategy, with confidence, we can say where the fishery is going to be. And, just one example of that is the industry leader for southern bluefin tuna down in Australia has said that they were having a lot of trouble securing loans from banks because their catch levels were fluctuating so widely that, the bank would say, 3 years, we don't know what your industry is going to look like. We can't trust that you'll be able to pay back this loan. But once their harvest strategy was in place, now they can get loans whenever they want because there's enough predictability in the system. And of course, that works for the market side of southern bluefin as well, that they can, with confidence, plan their businesses accordingly. So, if you don't get a harvest strategy in place, that kind of volatility in the fishing industry and shore side of that, retail side of that, that volatility will continue. Hopefully that answers your question, Christine.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for making reference to that stability and predictability they offer.
Does anyone have a final question at all? No? Okay, well, I would just like to take the opportunity to say thank you then. Thank you all for joining the webinar. Much appreciated. And a special thank you to Shana for presenting. If you do have any feedback or any questions that come to you later, please feel free to email me. I can certainly contact Shana later, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me circulating any answers. The next webinar actually takes place tomorrow at 4 p.m. UK time. It's going to be on traceability in action, ISF commitments and verification tools, and will be presented by Holly Kohler from ISSF. So I would just like to say a final thank you for everyone, and I hope you found that useful. I certainly did. I thought it was incredibly helpful. The recording will be online, as will the slides if you need to access them. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Shana, for all your time doing the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Tom, and thanks everyone for signing in today.
Thanks everyone. Goodbye.